So we basically had one group who did strength training, and we had one group who thought about doing strength training. Okay, everybody wanted to be in that group. And, you could argue whether it's statistical nonsense or whatever, but actually that group that thought about getting training got 5% stronger.
Whoa.
I'm thinking about it right now. Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
From stem cells to mapping the brain and medical ethics, we hope to give you a glimpse of the bright future ahead through discussions with some of the people making it happen. Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. So this week we spoke to Dan Gordon. Now Dan's a professor of exercise physiology, and his interests are in how we can maximise human athletic performance. He was also a Paralympian, and he's also a world record holder. We got to speak to him about quite a lot in this episode. The main things to pick out were how we measure exercise, the role that diet plays, ultra-endurance running, how to train for endurance and strength at the same time, and also the roles of the nervous system and someone's psychology in their performance. It's a bit of a longer episode, so this time I've included some timestamps, but we hope you enjoy it because we certainly enjoyed recording it. 3, 2, 1, and we're live. There we go, good start. Professor Gordon, thank you so much for joining us.
You're more than welcome. No, I'm looking forward to this.
So in this episode, we were thinking we might talk to you about human performance, in sport and training in general. What makes people perform better, and how can we measure this? And also what people can take away from an episode like this for their own training.
Sure.
So to kick us off, I was wondering, could we talk a bit about how can we evaluate exercise performance?
Gosh, start with the hard one. Okay. So I think we need to start with a kind of a caveat, which is a separation. There's a difference between exercise and there's a difference between performance. So if I want to measure performance, then the best measure of performance is performance. So and quite often that, as a sports scientist, I find that quite difficult because as a sports scientist, I want to measure everything. But actually, if I'm working with an athlete, what I want to be able to do is I just want to know, can you get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, or can I jump as high as I can? That's the true measure of performance. I suppose what we're seeking is ways in which, through sports science, we can evaluate the factors that contribute to the performance, or evaluate, for example, the way in which training has worked and so on. So when it comes to that, it really comes down to what it is you want to evaluate. It comes down to whether you're looking at strength, whether you're looking at endurance, range of motion. And then we really get into the nitty-gritty of asking the simple question about the validity and reliability of the measures that you want to use, which sounds very dull and very dry. But it is pointless measuring something if it's A, not valid, and B, it's not reliable. And that is really the trick. I think that's the trick in almost every area of science that we work, is that you've got to pick the tool that is right for the job. So the world is kind of our oyster. So we can go from laboratory-based tests. So we can, for example, if I want to measure somebody's, let's say, endurance capability, I could look at what's called their VO2 max, so their maximum oxygen uptake. I could record what we call the lactate threshold and the lactate turn point. So they represent the transitions from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. And that's a very useful indicator of a response to training. It's a useful indicator, for example, I can use that to help estimate endurance performance in terms of times.
And that switch happens when muscles no longer have oxygen to respire aerobically, I suppose, when there's not enough oxygen available.
No. You see, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. And it's a really, you see, that's, yeah. So I think part of the issue with that, I'm glad you've asked that question in that way, is I think traditionally we're taught the notion that lactate is a byproduct, which it is, of metabolism, but also that lactate is bad. But actually, if you perfuse a muscle with oxygen, it will still actually produce lactate. So even if you actually put somebody into a state where you put them to a hyperoxic environment, actually, even in a hyperoxic environment, the muscle will generate hydrogen ions and it will generate CO2 from oxidative phosphorylation. So the net result is you're still producing lactate. So it's not the lack of oxygen. The interesting thing really is it's the transition from the metabolism of fats to the metabolism of carbohydrates. So that's what the lactate turn point represents. So as an endurance athlete, that's fundamentally important because once I start metabolizing carbohydrate, then I start to accelerate the production of hydrogen ions and the production of lactate. But if I'm burning predominantly fats, actually what I'm doing is I'm generating my energy at a much, much slower rate. So that's a really important one. I can measure economy. So economy is fundamentally important to an endurance athlete. It's the analogy is having a car. And you talk to Jeremy Clarkson, and Jeremy Clarkson wants a car that is, power and acceleration and, doesn't worry about miles per gallon. But actually, as an endurance athlete, what I want to do lots of miles per gallon. So what I want is an athlete that uses less oxygen or less energy per footfall. So we can measure that on a treadmill-based test.
Although, is this the only factor at play? Because surely we can put more fuel into an endurance athlete. The amount of food that they have, for example, the amount of oxygen isn't necessarily limiting.
It's a really interesting one. So, yes, I mean, clearly, for example, if I've got an endurance athlete, I can fuel them up and I can do that. But in the end, the key to it is even if I've got X amount of fuel available, I'm still going to, based upon the notion of muscle mechanics, I'm still going to use X amount of energy to do that movement, independent of how much fuel that I've got. All the fuel does is allows me to prolong the amount of time I can sustain the exercise for. So, for example, we can extend somebody's endurance capability probably by about 15 to 20 minutes if we carbohydrate load them. What it won't do, it would allow me to increase my exercise intensity. But actually, if we think about endurance performance, I don't want to increase my exercise intensity, because if I increase my exercise intensity, I decrease the amount of time I can sustain that intensity for. That's why we get this beautiful hyperbolic relationship between intensity and duration. So what we look for is this oxygen cost. And what it's really related to is the ability, in terms of the amount of heat that we're producing and the ability to dissipate that heat. So if I've got a lower oxygen cost, I'm using less ATP per footfall, so the adenosine triphosphate. I'm producing less heat, and therefore my core temperature rises less. So in the end, the economy becomes a fundamental aspect in terms of endurance performance.
So to what extent does the environment therefore play a role? The Australian Open is currently on as we're recording this. They've had huge problems with temperatures kind of soaring up to 40 degrees Celsius. To what extent does the environment around you therefore play a role?
Enormous. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. And, if we talk about environmental physiology, it's not even just heat. I mean, clearly one of the things they've had going on in Melbourne fairly recently is they've had the factors with the dust in the air. They've had the smoke in the air. And so we know that if we take the heat per se, you put somebody in a hot environment, then you naturally change the way in which the blood is moved around the body. We naturally change the way in which we're going to dissipate heat. So the ramifications of that, of putting somebody in the heat, are if you put somebody in the heat that hasn't gone through acclimatization to the heat, what actually happens is we're really inefficient when we first expose somebody to the heat. And what actually happens when you first do that is that you get this redistribution of blood flow, which is such an inefficient way of doing things. Because if you then go and ask somebody to exercise, what the body's natural response is to do is not to provide the oxygen in the blood to the muscle. It's actually to move the blood to the periphery to dissipate the heat. So what you've got is a higher energy cost by putting somebody in the heat. It's only as you start to acclimatize that what actually happens is we start to increase our sweat rate. So it takes about 5 to 10 days to acclimatize to the hot environment. So we start to sweat more, but we get the redistribution of blood flow starts to dissipate back. That's an inefficiency. And so actually what then starts to happen is for the same stroke volume, that stroke volume is now being, rather than imparted to the periphery, it's now being imparted back to the working muscle.
And for people who live in hot environments for more than 5 to 10 days, are there any more adaptations that are shown?
In those individuals, yeah. So in those individuals, they clearly, they are just more efficient in working in the heat. So if you compare somebody who's unacclimatized to somebody who is a resident in those environments, the resident in those environments will have, for the same relative workload, they will have a lower heat production, they will have a higher heat tolerance, and they would have a lower cost to the exercise. And that is just a natural consequence of being exposed to that environment, either because you have lived there for a prolonged period of time, or because we also know there are genetic modifications through things like what we call heat shock proteins and so on, where the people are actually biologically adapted to the environment.
Could that adaptation be recreated by doing hot therapies, like using the sauna?
Yeah, I mean, the sauna is an interesting one, because the sauna, in a way, it does replicate it, but it's a different kind of heat. So one of the things you probably know when you go into a sauna is it's a really dry heat.
Yeah.
And most of the environments that we put athletes into tend not to be that dry.
Okay.
I worked a couple of years ago on what's called the Badwater Ultra Marathon.
Oh, that's an ultra that's done in the south of the USA,
In
right?
Death
Yes.
Valley, yeah. And it is crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So they
Just to explain, sorry, how many miles is that, and where are people running through?
okay, so they start at below sea level. They start at, I think it's 85 meters below sea level, at a place called Badwater, and it is the lowest point on the planet. And they start on the salt flats of Badwater, and then the race is I think it's 125 miles, but it's through Death Valley, and you end the race going up Mount Whitney. Now Mount Whitney's got a summit is 3,500 feet. It's really high, but they don't take them to the summit. They take them about halfway up. And the record for covering this distance is just over 24 hours.
Do people get any rest while they're running?
You can do what you want.
Okay.
So the rules are pretty broad, in the sense of you just cover the distance as quickly as you can. Whether you choose to sleep, that's fine, but the clock is still ticking. Whether you choose to fuel, the clock is still ticking. So it is a really arduous environment to be in. And of course, the thing is, it's dry heat. So in the dry heat, it's really easy to acclimatize. The thing that really messes with us biologically is the humidity. We can't acclimatize to humidity. So we can put something into a hot environment and actually will be acclimatized within about 4 days, 5 days. As soon as you add any humidity to it, that is what puts the stress, the real biological stress. Because what's happening is the ability to sweat is a function of your ability to impart what in essence is a fluid content from the skin into the atmosphere. But if the fluid content in the atmosphere is greater than the fluid content on the skin, you don't get that gradient. You can't get the sweat. Your core temperature goes up.
So you need the humidity to really generate that stress on the body.
You need the humidity to create the stress.
Okay.
So the small saunas and so on aren't the best thing for that. They're great for losing weight, but what we use is heat chambers. So we've got a portable heat chamber, which is it looks like a tent basically, and what it enables us to do is we can pump the heat up into that to about 40 degrees C at a max, which is pretty grim. And then we create humidity, and it's really Heath Robinson kind of science. We create humidity by just using little water sprayers, and we just create the water droplets until we can get the humidity up to what we want. So we ran a study last year where I had a PhD student from Brazil, and we're trying to replicate what it's like in Brazil. And Brazil gets really humid. But we managed to get it up to about 70% humidity, which was sufficient enough to put that stress on the individual. And so we know if we keep repeat exposing people to those environments, although they don't acclimatize fully to the humidity, they are starting to biologically adapt to the heat, but also they are getting a psychological adaptation to what it is like to be exercising in the heat.
The psychological versus the physical component, I think, is something really interesting and something I'd like to come back to later. But before the three of us dive deep into a rabbit hole, I'd first like to go back and talk a bit more about VO2 max.
Okay.
So this is the idea of VO2 max this is how much oxygen the body can take up in a given period of time from the air. How good a measure is this of aerobic fitness, or what's the word I'm looking for? Cardiorespiratory fitness.
Okay, I'm really glad you didn't say performance. Okay, so I'll clear that one up. It's a terrible predictor of performance. And I think I'll start there, because in many ways, the reason people are fascinated by VO2 max is because VO2 max is correlated with endurance performance. But everybody knows, correlations are not cause and effect. So I can correlate anything with anything. I mean, there's the website, isn't there? It's the website of spurious correlations.
And we have our soundbite right there. I can correlate anything with anything.
Yeah, and it's absolutely true, right?
Yeah.
You can absolutely. I mean, if you go on the spurious correlations website, they've got these correlations in, for example, I think it's the number of murders in New York City is positively a correlation of 1 correlated with the amount of apple pie eaten. Okay, so you can go, well, I can correlate anything with anything. So the fact that it was correlated with endurance performance led a lot of people to go, well, I need to generate really high VO2 maxes in my endurance runners. Actually, that kind of got dispelled a little bit.
Sorry, would you mind just speaking up, Cheers?
In the 90s. Tim Noakes, you've probably come across Tim Noakes, I suspect. So Tim Noakes produced some data which showed when they looked at marathon runners, they actually showed that the fastest runners didn't necessarily have the biggest VO2 maxes. And actually, there was quite a lot of variability in the data. But coming back to where we were, which is in terms of, is it a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness? And good, it's a fantastic measure of cardiorespiratory fitness. Because what it does, it allows us to see the integration of the cardiorespiratory system and the muscular systems under stress. And so the beauty about VO2 max is it's described by probably one of the simplest equations in physiology, which is the Fick equation. And the Fick equation quite simply says...
Our old friend.
Your old friend, yeah, everybody knows Fick. So it just has... It's a nicely balanced equation that on the one side you've got cardiac output, and on the other side you've got the arteriovenous oxygen difference. And so in order to get to VO2 max, you have to have a maximal cardiac output. You have to have a maximal extraction of oxygen at the muscle. And so if we come back from that and we think about it very simply, that ability to use the oxygen is a function of respiration. So it's a function of tidal volume and breathing frequency. It's a function of cardiac output, which is heart rate and stroke volume. And it's then a function of what we call QO2 and QCO2. So that's oxygen uptake at the muscle and carbon dioxide production at the muscle. So somebody who has got good cardiorespiratory health, by definition, will have a high VO2 max because they will have a high cardiac output and a reasonably high AVO2 difference. The AVO2 difference isn't massively different across population groups.
So I suppose what we're saying is that VO2 max, that value incorporated within that is some indication of how well your lungs are working, how well your heart is working, and how well your actual muscles are taking up that oxygen from the blood. And I suppose the interesting follow-up question from that is, which of those components in this whole system is typically limiting people's ability to do exercise?
Brilliant, love it. That's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, it is, and that it is such a great indication of those, because if you take all those components, you've got the respiratory, you've got the cardiovascular, and let's call it very loosely the muscular or the metabolic. The fact that we can now separate those out when we're collecting the data in a laboratory, so we can use what's called breath-by-breath analysis. So that allows us to then separate out the cardiovascular responses, the respiratory. It means that not only can I identify somebody's VO2 max, I can then identify, if the VO2 max is low, where the limitation is coming from. So in the general population group, the limitation is absolutely about oxygen delivery, it's cardiac output. That's the limitation. The AVO2 difference, I kind of hinted at it a moment ago. The AVO2 difference is no different really between an athletic population group and an untrained population group. But when you get into groups that are exhibiting pathologies, it's not just about cardiac output. Quite clearly, we know patients that got COPD, for example. We know patients who are asthmatic. They could actually have, particularly an asthmatic patient, could have the same cardiac output, but the limiting factor actually is just the ability to move that rich oxygen-rich air from the respiratory system into the circulation. But because VO2 max encompasses the tidal volume and the breathing frequency, and from that we get what's called minute ventilation. If I know what a standard response for minute ventilation is going to be, I can then identify where the limitation in a VO2 max test comes from. So I use VO2 max as kind of what we call the global measure. And then we have in the test, we can look at what is called 9 panels. It's a very untechnical name. But it was devised by a physiologist and medic in the US called Carl Wasserman. And Carl Wasserman came up with what's called a 9 panel. So it's basically 9 series of variables or interconnected variables. that allow you to identify where there's a limitation in exercise. So you'd always start with VO2 max, but then you've got a panel which shows you tidal volume. You've got tidal volume and minute ventilation, but we can compare that to the inspiratory capacity. So we can identify that actually, if they're hitting inspiratory capacity really early on in the test, that actually what we've got is a limitation to flow. So we know it's a respiratory limitation. We can look, for example, at ventilatory thresholds. So it's a non-invasive way of estimating your lactate threshold. And we can do that in looking at the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide. So if that occurs early on in the test, then it's either a cardiovascular limitation, so we'd look at one of the cardiovascular panels, or it's something going on metabolically, we'd look at one of the muscle-based panels.
And if it's cardiac output that's limiting most people's capacity for delivering oxygen, then to what extent is this amenable to training then?
Yeah, so it's a fundamental aspect of training, particularly if we're dealing with an endurance athlete. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. And the trick then is how do you increase somebody's cardiac output? And what we know, if we go to kind of, well, what happens with the training is that we get what's called eccentric and concentric hypertrophy primarily of the left ventricle. So we know that we get an expansion of the ventricle size, but you get an expansion of the ventricle wall. And the how is quite interesting, because this is really at the heart of where a lot of mistakes in endurance training are made, I think. What we understand is that to drive cardiac output up, it's a function of heart rate and stroke volume. So the notion would be, well, all I've got to do is just keep increasing the stroke volume, and over time, surely my cardiac output's going to go up. But what we actually understand is that stroke volume reaches its peak at about 50% of VO2 max. So if you want to boost cardiac output, the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to train somebody submaximally. It's no good putting somebody on doing, intervals and really high intensity training. You've got to train submaximally, because that's where the stroke volume will be increased.
And is this because as your heart rate gets higher and higher, actually you can't maintain that stroke volume?
Correct.
Because your heart doesn't fill or it fills in a shorter period of time?
Correct. That's exactly it. And so what we understand is that it's only when you get to really highly trained athletes does the stroke volume go beyond the 50% VO2 max, and will actually keep rising up to the point of VO2 max.
And I suppose this is where the idea of zones of training comes in. Mm-hmm. What is the optimal zone? Just to clarify, a zone of training referring to how intense training is. So I suppose what you're saying is to increase somebody's cardiac output, perhaps at least at the beginning in untrained people, it's more steady state, low intensity exercise, which is going to increase that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the zones of training it's a nice point, because it interconnects a lot of the things we've talked about so far. That I suppose it depends on the sport that we work with. I mean, we're in Cambridge, so most people think about rowing in Cambridge. Mm-hmm. So in rowing, they tend to talk about 6 training zones. I'm from a cycling and a running background. We tend to talk about 4 to 5 training zones.
Is that because cyclists and runners just aren't working as hard?
We just don't work as hard. Yeah, we sit down. I know rowers sit down, but we really do sit down. But in essence, the way we identify training zones generally is using blood lactate. Because one of the issues you've got of using anything like heart rate or VO2 is the relationship between heart rate and VO2 and exercise intensity is linear. So you don't see anything in the data. It's just a perfectly linear response to exercise intensity. Whereas blood lactate shows a curvilinear response. And what we see is when we get to that transition we were talking about earlier on, which is the transition from fats to carbohydrates, you get a very sudden increase in the blood lactate concentration. So if you imagine you put a marker at that point there, that's already created 2 zones. You've got one above, one below. What we also understand is there is a first point of demarcation on the blood lactate curve, which occurs really early on. And what tends to happen is that the blood lactate concentration rises only slightly. It probably goes up by about 0.5 millimole and then levels out. And we call that point LT1, and we call the second point LT2. So if you imagine now I've got a zone between LT1 and LT2 where lactate isn't rising but heart rate is going up very gradually, then of course that's where we do steady training, because lactate's not rising. And that fits very nicely with what we're talking about in terms of stroke volume, because that zone is around about 50 to 60, 65% VO2 max. We go above LT2 and we move into tempo zone training, which is a classic one with runners. You do about 40 minutes of training in that zone. And above that is where we prescribe intervals. Below LT1 is where you do your recovery. because at that point you're not producing lactate. So it's ideal for removal of lactate.
So for somebody who's not a pro athlete but's just interested in developing their athletic abilities, would you say it's a good idea to do a combination of different zones of training? Some high intensity, some low intensity?
Yes, it is. But there is a caveat to that, which is it's a bit like building a house or building a pyramid. In the sense of you look at a pyramid, and a pyramid looks beautiful. You've got this enormous structure. I don't know why I'm doing hand signals when I'm doing a podcast. But you've got this enormous structure. And everybody looks at the top of the pyramid. But actually, the fundamental part is what's going on at the bottom. It's the same with an iceberg, right? Everybody sees the top of it, but it's what's going on underneath. If you imagine that, or building a house, you build a house and the house looks beautiful and it's a fantastic house. And then you move in and then the builder says, yeah, we built this house, but we didn't put any foundations in. The house will still look great, but it becomes really shaky and eventually the house falls down. Training is the same as that. You have to put the foundations in. So the foundations are achieved through that continuous training, that steady training, and then we can put the intervals on top. If you hit the intervals first, you get an adaptation, but it's not sustainable, and you're more likely actually to get an athlete who is going to suffer injury or overtraining.
And to what extent should you train for an event by doing that event itself?
Yes, I read this was one of the questions. So this is quite an interesting one because I think a lot of this depends on the coaching philosophy that you have. So, for example, if you take a 400-meter runner, there are two schools of thought. One of the schools of thought is that you need to be good at running 400 meters, therefore run 400 meters. But actually, there is a logical school of thought, which is if all I do is train at 400 meters, I'm only good at running 400. Actually, what I've got to do, which sounds ridiculous, I've got to run 401 meters, which sounds slightly, because I've got to run through the line. So the more logical school of thought actually is that you've got to train both over and under distance. And what we tend to do, we say, with the 400-meter runner is we would, in the winter, the preparatory phase where we are now, is we might have the athletes doing things like 300-meter repetitions. They'll run 300 meters, but they won't run them flat out. They'll run them at, say, 90% of their 400-meter pace. And they'll do repeats of these. They might do 8 to 10 of these 300 meters, but they'll do them off a recovery of about 90 seconds. They'll also do over-distance training in the winter. So they'll be doing 500-meter reps and 600-meter reps. But again, they'll be running those at a percentage of their 400-meter time. So a 600-meter rep, early on in the winter, we might be saying, okay, we want you to run that at 85%, and then we'll boost it up. But we might only do 3 to 4 reps of those. As we come into the competitive phase, we'll start to take the over-distance events out, particularly the 600s. The 300s will remain, but now we'll run the 300s at flat-out 300-meter pace, but we will increase the recovery time. And what we've done is we haven't had to expose them to the 400. We're learning all the things about 400. What we might do with the 400, if we want to actually run the 400, is it's about, rather than metabolic training, it's actually about learning how to pace the 400. Because in the other distances, in the 300s, when you run them at 90% of 400-meter pace and so on, you're not learning how to run the distance. So at some point, you've probably got to run the distance. But it tends to be for pacing more than it does for actual biological adaptation.
That's really interesting. So you can almost decompose aspects of an event and train those aspects, or what an athlete will need to do well in those aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. And you would do that across any distance or any sport. Classically with marathon runners, one of the things we would do with marathon runners is we would never get a marathon runner to run a marathon. Okay, it's too damaging, it's too fatiguing. So most of the work they will do is about building up to that. But we might say to them, right, we need you to do a lot of 5K repeats. So we'd do 8 5K repeats, but we would ask them to run those at marathon pace off a reasonably short recovery. That might be something we do in the winter, whereas we get into the summer, we might keep the 5K repeats but do less of them, but on a slightly longer recovery. But we want them now to be closer to 5K speed. But we might also do a lot of very short intervals because we need to obviously get some speed into the legs. But we might do a large number of those in two say, sets of activity.
I guess the big elephant in the corner here is diet.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah.
What's the kind of consensus on this then in really kind of high performance sport?
Well, a lot of it depends on the sport that we're engaging in. I mean, the classic story that everybody always relates to is diet can't be important because Usain Bolt ate chicken nuggets before the Olympic final at London. Actually, it didn't matter what he ate before the Olympic final. It makes no difference.
It matters what he ate probably the year beforehand.
Correct. Yeah. But on the day of the Olympic final, where all he's got to run is from point A to point B in 10 seconds, it makes no difference what Usain Bolt on that day. It just makes no odds. Now, if I was dealing with a marathon runner, then we've got a very, very different question, because I haven't got 10 seconds. I've got 2 hours. Sub 2 hours. Last year. So I've got to fuel appropriately, and then you have to think about, right, what is the fuel that is absolutely fundamental, and you can't get around it. It's carbohydrate. There's no simple way of beating that.
So you want energy which is quickly accessible by the body, essentially.
Correct.
Now I wonder how does that translate to people who run ultra events? You mentioned Badwater. Do they stop and sort of eat sweets, or how what are the ways that people get their nutrition?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we went to Badwater, and there was a group of us. There was 3 physiologists and a psychologist, and we went out there, and one of the guys that was on the trip was a guy called Professor Ralph Benneker. And Ralph Benneker is probably one of the world-leading authorities on endurance performance. And we were going out, and we were chatting away, and Ralph's like, I don't think we're really going to learn much. I think this is good. It's a good experience. We're not going to learn much. Oh, my life. Did we know nothing? Nothing. Because you've really alluded to the point. And actually, when we sat back and we looked at it, my God, we've been idiots. These guys aren't running a marathon, so carbohydrate's irrelevant. All that's relevant is energy. It's calories. So you look inside their support vehicles, and you're right. They've got stuff in there that you would never recommend to an athlete. Everything from, just in America they call them candy bars, to there was no fruit. There was nothing like that at all. It was all about instant energy. And to the point where I still vividly remember we were about 3/4 of the way through the race, and one of the runners we were working with, called Lisa Smith-Batchen, and she was at the time the record holder for the female event. And she said, I just need fuel. I need fuel. What do you want? I want a cheeseburger. So they sent a support vehicle off and drove out of Death Valley in about an hour, McDonald's, picked up a cheeseburger. Of course, it's not going to get cold in Death Valley. And she ran eating a cheeseburger. Now, where's that in the textbooks? It doesn't exist. But what she needed was just straight calories. And so they just fueled them in any way they possibly can. I mean, there are caveats to that. You've got to be careful with things like the gut flora. So certain foods will affect the gut and will affect kind of the release of the substrates from the gut.
By the flora, sorry, you mean the bacteria?
The bacteria, yeah. So we have to think about that carefully. But in that kind of race situation, the rules really do go out of the book. Whereas when we come back to, say, Tour de France, or we come back to marathon running, or more conventional, perhaps less stupid events, the conventions apply that you have to go back to what we understand in terms of substrate, and it's carbs that will predominate.
We're sorry for listening to this and you run ultra marathons.
Yeah, apologies. Yes.
Yeah. Although this slightly asks the question: it might be possible to run the Badwater ultra marathon running on cheeseburgers, but is that necessarily desirable? And have kind of ultra marathon runners and ultra endurance event scientists properly looked into it? Because it's my understanding that there's not necessarily as much money and as much research in this field.
Yeah, they have, and actually it's a big area of interest, because ultramarathoning now is one of the big growth areas in sport, because there's an awful lot of interest now in these extreme events, whether they are the extreme events running through Badwater, or of course the classic one everybody wants to do is Marathon des Sables. So this is running across the Sahara.
There was a documentary that came out about a guy who got lost about 10 years ago, didn't he?
Yes,
and almost died. And
yeah.
I think he now runs the race. He still runs the race.
Yeah.
So this touches, sorry to cut you off,
no,
slightly on a question I had about what you were saying, which I suspect that from what you said, the psychological component of what you eat has an effect in terms of, if somebody's training very hard to a high level, that's psychologically taxing. Mm-hmm. And perhaps if people have limited willpower, just letting people eat what they enjoy eating has a benefit.
Yeah, and that was the case with Lisa in that marathon, ultramarathon. They'd got all the foods in the car, in the van that she needed. But in her mind, she'd got fixated on a cheeseburger. Well, actually, just give her a cheeseburger, because in the end, it's got the same calories that she's going to get. You wouldn't recommend it. So, yeah, absolutely. But It is an area where there's a lot of research now. We've got colleagues here who have, one of our colleagues has run the Marathon des Sables, and Justin ran a study a number of years ago where he had about 75 participants, and they worked with them, and they were really interested they looked at the diet of these athletes prior to the marathon, they looked at their diet throughout the marathon, and it's highly varied in terms of what they're eating. They all understand that they've got to get calories in, but it's how they get the calories in is very, very different across the athletes.
Yeah, and I remember, I think, in Scott Jurick's book, him mentioning that actually it got easier at the end of the marathon because you were running with your hallucinations in Death Valley.
Yeah, and that's actually true. I mean, there's a chap that we met out there who's an extraordinary character. I mean, he's absolutely fantastic, and he was called Major Maples. He was the major in the U.S. Marines, Major Maples, and at the time he was based out in Iraq, but he would fly in every year to do Badwater, and I think when we were there, he was on his 5th attempt, and he'd never finished it. He couldn't. It's extraordinary actually, because you think, oh gosh, he's been in Iraq, he must be heat acclimatized and so on. He couldn't finish it,
and it's only 135 miles.
Gosh, what's he playing at, right? But the one year they found him on the road. When I say found him, his support vehicle were with him, but the other support vehicles found him, and he was on the road, but he was crawling on the road. Now you're not allowed to touch the runner. You touch the runner, then the runner is pulled out of the race. So the runner, can't be helped in any way. And the story goes that he was crawling on the road, and people were like, what are you doing? And he said, duck, because they're landing jumbo jets. And so he was so badly hallucinating, they thought they were landing planes onto this road. And eventually they pulled him out on medical grounds, which was quite right. But that's what happens to people under these really extreme conditions. It kind of really causes that particular unique kind of fatigue that you get.
You mentioned earlier that like sports associations like British Cycling, if they could, would like to reduce the stress of their cyclists in sort of all other aspects of their life. What I'm wondering is, I wonder if having had a stressful life before you are in the context of training for an event helps prepare people for stress in sport or not. It'd be something interesting to look at.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I don't know what the answer is.
Because you think about Mike Tyson, for example, incredible boxer, came from an incredibly deprived background, very tough life, and you wonder if that in some way helped him become the boxer he was.
I think it's a very interesting point, isn't it? And I think I don't think there's any surprise that a lot of the athletes, particularly in the US system, have come from those very deprived backgrounds, and less even you look in American football and so on. I also think it perhaps explains why it's a lot of those athletes that fall apart as well, because I think there is that you come into that environment. We're almost getting into the sociology of this really, but you're coming from that environment which is incredibly deprived. You're able to cope with the stress. You're able to cope with the collegiate system, which is incredibly challenging. And then actually when you make it, you haven't got the coping mechanisms in terms of being able to make it. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, but of course we'll probably never really know as elite sport now, particularly in the UK, because we certainly don't have what we used to have, which is people would be having a profession and then come into sport. Your profession is I'm a sportsman or sportswoman, and then I go through and transition out. I think those days have probably gone. I think you're likely to see it perhaps more in amateur to recreational sport, where you've got people perhaps who have got more stressful jobs. Maybe there's evidence to show they excel. But it's a really fascinating question, actually. Yeah.
And if we're speaking about stress, as well, there's the big question of when that stress occurs. We know that there are kind of crucial windows as people are growing up where stress can have really long-term effects on everything from kind of mental health to physical performance.
Yes, and of course, stress is the elephant in the room with athletes, because in terms of training, we're trying to impose a stress. And we're trying to put the athlete into an incredibly stressful environment. Training is stressful. And particularly when you've got athletes at the elite level, it's incredibly stressful. But actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to put a biological stress on somebody, but at the same time trying to minimize psychological stress. And that's a really hard act to do, particularly as you're taking an athlete towards a major games. We've got Tokyo coming up this year. And if you were measuring the stress in an athlete, you're measuring a stress curve. So you're measuring the ratio of cortisol to testosterone in those athletes. Boy, would you start to see that ramping up. Even in the athletes who are the laid-back athletes. It's incredibly stressful. And actually, the Olympic Village is the worst place to put an athlete. Because what do you see all the time? You see everybody wearing their Olympic tracksuits. Everybody's talking about the same thing. It's a terrible place to be. But actually, that's really where a lot of performance is made. You make and break performance is in there. It's the people who can cope with that stressful environment. In the end, most athletes, particularly in an Olympic final, are physically the same. You've got the freaks in nature. You've got the Usain Bolts that are different and so on. But pretty much everybody's the same. So in the end, what it comes down to, an awful lot of it is the psychology of what is going on in that environment, in that event.
Switching back to a more physiological topic, most of us aren't just interested in training for endurance. People are also interested in training for power and strength. So how do you train to develop these things simultaneously? So how would I, say somebody proposed split, if you're going to train 4 times a week, twice a week focus on your endurance, and twice a week do strength training. What would you make of that?
Okay, go on.
And to what extent are they mutually exclusive, perhaps?
Yeah, so this is quite interesting. It is really controversial in many ways, because I think it's a bit of a mixed school of thought on this. The thing we do know is that strength is detrimental to endurance. And one of the things we understand is that a fundamental limitation to endurance is capillary density. And we know endurance training increases capillarization, decreases mean transit time of blood, increases oxygen consumption, oxygen uptake from the muscle. Strength training reduces capillarization, promotes less aerobic enzyme activity, reduces mitochondrial density, but increases anaerobic enzyme activity and increases anaerobic substrates such as phosphocreatine and so on.
Because if you just want to do something for a fraction of a second or a second, then it doesn't matter what blood is coming in. There's not enough time for it to have an impact.
Exactly. The kinetics is far too slow. So you look at it on the surface and go, yeah, okay, there's clearly an interactory effect going on there. But if we take, for example, say a 4,000 meter pursuit cyclist or a rower, they're endurance events, but they need strength. So, how do you get around that? Well, you have to accept that there is an inhibitory effect, and we have to recognize that we cannot just ignore one of those components of fitness. And so what you have to do is you then have to say, well, we're going to have to train strength. And we're going to have to train endurance, but we might be able to find ways in which we can circumvent those limitations from the strength in the endurance training. And this is why we use things like intervals, for example, because the interval training can accelerate some of those growth factors that we're talking about. So the losses that you potentially are going to make with strength, to a degree, can be brought back with the intervals. So if I wanted to train strength, and you made an interesting point, which is strength and power, and it's really important to separate those two out.
Power being the rate of force production.
Correct. Yeah. And I think quite often we're a bit sloppy, really. I think we talk about strength and power being almost the same thing, and they are separate, and one actually is a function of the other. Power is a function of strength. So if I want to make you more powerful, and I want to increase the rate of force development, sure, I could do power training, but unless the muscle is strong enough, I'm never going to be able to sustain and repeat that rate of force development. So the key actually is a bit like we talked about with endurance. It's about building a base in terms of strength and getting some hypertrophy in the muscle and getting that kind of muscular development, and then bringing in the power-based training on top of it. And with power-based training, again, everybody thinks, well, do you do power-based training by increasing the rate of force development? Do you do it by doing very fast movements? Well, actually, not necessarily the case. Actually, what you can do is you can do power-based training by just using really heavy loads, but trying to move it as fast as possible.
So like a very heavy deadlift.
Yeah.
Something that people typically think of as just being purely for strength.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you would try and move it very, very rapidly. And so what that will do, it will start to initiate the biological adaptation that we want. The icing is then to reduce that load. So, for example, let's say you do squats. So you might be doing squats, and you might be doing the squats to develop, you do the strength-based training, then you're trying to develop power. So you do these very, very heavy loads. you will do very short number of repetitions and short number of sets. We tend to work on 3s and 5s. So you probably do no more than 5 repetitions and 3 sets if I want to develop power. But then what I want to do is I actually then want to get that rate of force development. So I want to increase now the neural recruitment. So what I do is I reduce the load and I now turn them from squats to jump squats. And so now what I'm doing is I'm now changing the rate of force development, but I still got the resistance. Or you can go the whole hog, which is then going to plyometric training.
So what you're saying is to develop power, perhaps doing a strength exercise and follow it up by something which is the same movement pattern but with a much lower load, done much more explosively.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And where it gets really complicated with power, I mean, it's the same with strength, but particularly with power, is the majority of the power in most activities comes from the eccentric phase of the muscle action.
So this is really interesting. I'd actually heard about people who wanted to develop the ability to jump, to play basketball, for example, doing deadlifts where at the top of the deadlift they would drop the bar.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a really important point, because when we think about muscle actions work through what's called a stretch shortening cycle. So this is the notion of going from an eccentric to a concentric to an eccentric. And under eccentric loading, the muscle is lengthening. And what's fascinating about eccentric loading is when the muscle... No, I'm going to go back. Under concentric loading, because concentric is quite easy to understand. Under concentrics, if you've got a high load, you've got a slow velocity. So it's a classic thing. You go to the gym, I put a really heavy load on, I can't move it fast. If I reduce the load, the velocity increases. Under eccentric loading, it's a different relationship. As the load increases, so does the velocity. So what we can do under eccentric loading is we can actually increase the rate of force development. But to do that, what we have to do is we have to put the muscle under heavy loads and under high braking forces. So a great example would be, and I don't recommend people do this at home, would be imagine you've got a Smith's machine. I think most people probably use a Smith's machine in a gym. So it's one of these weights machines where you've got the bar, but it's on a pulley system or on magnets. It's much better to do this on magnets. And what you might do is you might say, right, we're going to stand you under the bar and we're going to raise the bar and we're going to have the bar just sitting over the top of the shoulders. It's just gently touching the shoulders. But we're going to put on 200% of your body weight on the bar. And then we're going to stand there and we're going to drop the bar. So what you're going to do, you're going to resist the movement. But what you've done is you've resisted it as quickly as you can because you don't want the bar to collapse under eccentric loading. So that is an example of doing an eccentric action. Now that's quite extreme. So the other way of doing it is doing things like negative lifts. So in a negative lift, it's where, in essence, you are having an assistance to do the concentric action, and then you bring the movement back. So, for example, if you're doing a leg extension, the extension of the leg is assisted. You go to full extension and then back to flexion under a high load. You now have to resist that load as it's coming back.
Another example to help somebody visualize this would be bringing yourself down from the bar from a pull-up.
Yes, exactly the same. Yeah.
Or doing, say, a bicep curl. So the upwards phase would be the concentric one as your muscle shortens.
Yeah.
And you can imagine putting more weight on it and that movement being slower. And then you can imagine putting more weight coming down.
And it'd be really fast.
And your muscle lengthens and suddenly it's going faster.
Yes. And your job then is to try and resist that load as it's falling.
And I guess questions are kind of traditional perceptions that we're training muscle and our cardiovascular system, and actually we can train our nervous system as well to do things as well.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, I remember back to my very, very first year in academia, and very naive, and we ran, trying to build studies for undergraduates, and we ran this really simple study, and it was, and again, it was what was in the news. And we ran a study which was, can you make somebody think that they're stronger than they are? So we basically had one group who did strength training and we had one group who thought about doing strength training. Okay, everybody wanted to be in that group. And, you could argue whether it's statistical nonsense or whatever, but actually that group that thought about getting training got 5% stronger.
Whoa.
I'm thinking about it right now.
Yeah, and we looked at the data. Okay, the sample size was fairly small, and it wasn't the best study, and it wasn't greatly controlled, but it was quite telling that there was an increase. And what we found with the increase was there was an increase in neural recruitment.
In some sports, athletes have to dehydrate in order to make weight. How bad is that for performance, and also I suppose for health, if you're interested in that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, on both it's bad. I mean, there is no harm. Gosh, this is a complicated one. There is no harm in having a mild dehydration. Okay, but we're not talking about mild dehydration. We're talking about quite severe dehydration to shed quite a large amount of mass. And we know that there are both acute effects, and actually what we don't know, but we have a fairly good guess, is there are chronic effects of doing this. Those athletes aren't going to do it once, they're going to do this on multiple occasions and so on. So we know that, the classic analogy is that, they go into the boxing ring as an example, and they've done this, and they look $1 million. They've got nothing in the muscle. There's nothing. Because what they're actually doing is they're affecting the ability of the central nervous system to recruit the muscles. The central nervous system is affected under states of dehydration. That's why we become severely ill-coordinated. I mean, I'm sure you've probably, or your listeners have probably seen that extraordinary video footage at the end of the Hawaii Ironman. Have you seen this?
No.
It's worth looking at. So the Hawaiian Ironman, and this is going back probably about 10, 15 years, and they're tracking the two leaders in the women's race of the Hawaiian Ironman. And as they come towards the end of it, they're coming towards the line. It is the most extreme example of what happens in dehydration, that they can't run in a straight line. They're falling over. They're crawling on the ground. And, it's actually a really hard thing to watch. I mean, it's painful to watch because, again, it's like we talked about with the Badwater. They couldn't pick the athletes up because these athletes are trying to cross the line, and they're trying to crawl across the line, and then they get up and they fall over. That is dehydration at its absolute extreme. That adverse effect, not just on the central, but really a direct effect on the brain. And they had no spatial awareness. They had no idea where they were. And it is like watching people run on just rubber legs. So if you imagine doing that and then saying, well, I'm going to go and box 12 rounds. So it has really, really large ramifications. So it's something that really has to be frowned upon. There's got to be more sensible ways of making the weight. And of course, the most sensible way of making the weight is through diet and exercise.
And I guess the question for people who are not trying to cut down their weight to reach a certain category is, how would you define kind of mild dehydration, and then moving into dehydration that impacts on performance?
Yeah. So we would say mild dehydration is about 5% body loss, 5% weight loss.
Which is quite a lot for, say, a 70 kilo person.
Yeah, it's still quite a lot, but it is quite an interesting thing. So it actually gets quite interesting if you've got a 5% dehydration, or a 5% dehydration. It actually has no effect on performance. So there are a number of studies that were done back in the early 2000s, and they were done by a guy called Lars Nybo. And what Nybo was looking at was, it stemmed from a lot of the work which was coming from Tim Noakes' lab, which was to do with what's called a central governor theory, which is in essence what limits us. Is it in the brain? So Nybo was quite interested in this. So what he did was he dehydrated his participants, and he deliberately dehydrated them to 5% of body mass, and then they ran them through a series of trials. But one of the trials was they basically had them in a condition where they exercised, but they then exercised them wearing a cooling jacket. And so one of the things that they were saying was that it's temperature that is the limiting factor. So when they dehydrated them and didn't control core temperature, it started to become problematic. It was doable, but it started to become problematic. When they dehydrated them, but then regulated core temperature, performance was completely unaffected. So the limiting factor wasn't the dehydration, it's the core temperature.
Which is actually what we started speaking about at the beginning.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can imagine this fight between maintaining water and reducing your core temperature when you starts to rise, because both are quite disadvantageous if you push them to extremes.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways that's the crux of it, and that's where, again, a lot of the commercialization is coming in, is in the way in which we can regulate core temperature. Cooling suits. British Cycling use very bog standard things. They put their athletes' hands and they put their feet into buckets of water. It's far more efficient than trying to cool the core. It's much quicker. Primarily because you've got high capillary density in those regions. We know we can use cooling suits. The NIBO study, they just used a cooling suit to do that kind of work. And you see a lot of athletes using this kind of stuff now, particularly we had the World Athletics Championships not so long ago in I think it was Doha. And they were trying to run the marathon. It was 3 a.m. in the morning in Doha time. And I think they started at a temperature of about 35 degrees C for a marathon.
That's centigrade.
That's centigrade. And it was just crazy temperatures. And so what the athletes were doing was they were in essence pre-cooling. Because if you can pre-cool somebody, you can increase the thermal strain range. So if I can bring your core temperature down before I start exercising, the range over which temperature has got to rise before it becomes detrimental is increased. So it sounds adverse, that actually what we do is we cool them, we don't warm them up in a hot environment.
And I guess, anecdotally, we've kind of experienced the same thing. I'm sure when you walk outside, having been in a nice warm room, thinking, I only need a t-shirt, and it's only a couple of minutes after walking that actually your body temperature has dropped, or your skin temperature, has dropped enough for you to actually realise.
Absolutely, it's the same equivalent. Yeah.
We have one final question actually, which we haven't really touched upon, but we're wondering, how personal is this research to you? So you've participated in really high level sport at the Paralympics, and we're wondering, do you apply these sorts of things to your own training and your own kind of activity?
I was a terrible athlete, and I suspect I was probably quite hard to coach to a certain degree, because of course, I was involved in sports science, but I think I was lucky because British Cycling is a highly scientific organisation, so everything in British Cycling is data driven, and that's I live by data. So I have been fortunate in that sense, and I was fortunate then one of my other roles was I was the physiologist of the Great Britain Paralympic endurance running team for a number of years. So I had that kind of dual role, which meant I could kind of work in research and work in the applied field, but also be an athlete. So now I suppose I've had that advantage in the sense of I understand what it takes. So when we were talking about all those factors that affect performance, I know what it takes in terms of and the sacrifices that you have to make and the strains and that you put an athlete under. So particularly when I work with clients, less so I think with research, when I work with clients, I think that comes out. I think with research, my research is really driven by, I think, things that just genuinely interest me and have always interested me. So I've always been interested in what limits endurance capability. And that's led into other areas. That's led into why I'm interested in pacing. That's led in why I'm interested in this is going to sound wrong. I'm interested in female athletes, but I'm interested in female physiology and what limits female physiology. And so everything has kind of spawned from that one area. They all kind of eventually tie back, but I think having had the opportunity to work as an elite athlete, I suppose allows me to at least set these things in context. Yeah.
We've talked a lot so far about gaining fitness.
Yeah.
And perhaps very relevantly to for lots of us who perhaps spend a week not doing very much, maybe in the summer just lounging around by a pool. How quickly do we lose fitness following inactivity? And does this depend on how fit we were in the first place?
That's a really good question, isn't it? And this is really at the heart of, I suppose, a lot of the groups that we've spoken about today. It's at the heart of what people like NASA want to know about. It's the heart of what sports teams want to know about. And a lot of it does depend on the components of fitness we're dealing with. But let's take an easy one. So let's take cardiorespiratory fitness. What we understand, if you have a complete cessation of training, within 4 weeks, you've got a 10% loss in 4 weeks. But the real kicker is if you want to get that 10% back, it's probably going to take at least 18 months.
Wow.
That's really unexpected. I would have thought it was the reverse.
No, and of course, if I have been, say, a world-class athlete and I've had a 10% loss, it's probably going to take me over 18 months to get that back, because the gains become smaller and smaller and smaller. So if I had a 10% loss, but I was incredibly unfit and I'd only got a VO2 max of, let's say, 42, 44 mils per kilogram per minute, and I stopped training, I can get it back reasonably quickly. But it's when we are, when you've got college students, university students, you're looking at potentially up to about an 18-month time period.
And what about a smaller period of inactivity, maybe 2 weeks, for example?
Yeah, so in 2 weeks, you go, well, sure, it's 5% drop in 2 weeks. If it's 10% in 4 weeks, it's not. And actually, what we understand, it's very much an exponential decay. So we actually get quite rapid reductions early on, and then it starts to level out. So although 4 weeks sounds like 10%, and then 8 weeks is going to be 20. It's not 20% is not going to come after 8 weeks. That 20% loss is going to take a lot longer to get to.
Anyway, I think that's all the questions we had. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for hosting it.
Thank you for listening to the Phaedra podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then head to Spotify or iTunes to hear more.
As ever, we'd love to hear what you think, and you can reach us via our Facebook page or by email. See you next time.